Imagine that you are a sales representative for Apple. Customer comes in and says, I really want to be able to buy a computer that I can repair on my own. I like to be able to update the components when I want to, and if something breaks, I want to be able to buy something and then just kind of fix it. Now, you know that MacBook Pros are notoriously difficult to repair. Apple, solders components directly to the motherboard, and they use these really tiny screws that are hard to unscrew unless you have very specialized tools. So what do you tell her? Should you just make an outright lie and tell her that, of course, she can repair her MacBook Pro with ease if that's what she buys? Or, on the other hand, should you tell her, no, don't buy a MacBook Pro if that's what you're looking for. Go across the street and buy a Dell instead. It seems like if we just let you outright lie, if we say that you can just tell whatever lies to your customer you want to make the sale, that's way too permissive. But on the other hand, if we say that you have a duty to your customer to tell her the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth, to the extent that you have to advertise competitors' products when they are superior, that seems way too stringent. It seems like that's not quite fair to you, and it's also not quite fair to Apple if their own employees are required to advertise the products of other customers. So the question that we need to figure out and answer to is, what are your duties to your customers with respect to lying and deceiving? What is the reasonable middle ground between these two extremes of way too much permissiveness and way too much stringentness? Let's explore. So let's begin with Albert Z. Carr's famous paper, Is Business Bluffing Ethical?, which was published in the Harvard Business Review in 1968. Now, what Carr notes is that in particular arenas of life, we have different rules for engaging in moral deliberations. So for example, suppose you're playing poker. When you're playing poker, it's perfectly fine to bluff. If you have only an ace in your hand and another player has a much stronger hand and, you raise instead of folding, and as a result, the other player who has a stronger hand folds, and then you win, that's called being a good poker player. There's nothing wrong with bluffing in that sense of bluffing. But poker is not a situation where anything goes. So if you're colluding with other players across the table, that's unethical. If you are getting other players drunk so that they will calculate badly, that's also unethical. And if you hide an ace up your sleeve and then pull it out and then play it, that's doing something that, as Carr notes, could get you shot in the Wild West. So poker is not a situation where anything goes. Now, the reason why Carr talks about poker is that he thinks that in business, there are also special rules. And it wouldn't make sense to think that in business, the same rules that you have to follow, when you're in church or when you're talking to your romantic partners apply. Now, there's something clearly right about this idea. It is the case, undoubtedly, that in different domains, we need different rules for moral deliberations. For example, don't lie and don't deceive are both excellent rules for situations where you're talking to your partner about your sexual history. But those are terrible rules in situations when the Nazis are knocking on your door and there are Jewish people hiding inside. And I ask you, are there any Jews inside? Of course, it would be wrong to avoid deception in that situation. You should deceive the Nazis. But the problem with Carr's approach is that it's not clear what the actual rules are that he would like us to follow in business. So his presentation of any actual rules are very vague. So one possible reading of Carr is that he thinks that whatever is legal is ethical in business. And here's a quotation that supports this reading. If the laws governing their business change, or if public opinion becomes clamorous, they will make the necessary adjustments. But morally they have done nothing wrong. As long as they comply with the letter of the law, they're within their rights to operate their businesses as they see fit. So that's one possible reading of Carr. Another reading of Carr is that anything that conventional morality says is okay in business is permissible in business. Now, neither of these criteria succeeds. Neither criterion succeeds. And to see why, what we can do is we can use a test that I appealed to in my last video. So we can ask, are these criteria too permissive or are these criteria too stringent? And in this case, the criteria are clearly too permissive. So to figure out that they're too permissive, all we need to do is find a situation where they permit something that is clearly wrong. So let's take a case of something that we now know is wrong, but which was at one point legal and supported by conventional morality. Slavery is one such case. Sexual harassment another such case. Child labor in factories is a third such case. But I want you to imagine looking in the eyes of somebody who is enslaved, or somebody who is a victim of really horrendous sexual harassment, or a child who is working in dangerous conditions in a factory. And I want you to imagine telling that person that the abuse that they're enduring is in fact morally permissible because of the fact that what they're enduring is perfectly legal and accepted by the conventional morality of their time. When you consider the suffering and the rights violations that are involved in practices like that, I think you can see that it's just ridiculous. It's shocking to think that anybody would believe that cultural practices and the law tell us what is moral. That as long as something is culturally acceptable and legal, it is moral. To hold that belief is to have a profound lack of empathy. It is to lack the ability to understand that other people have a point of view and a perspective, and that those points of view and perspectives matter. So I think that Carr was still onto something. He was still onto something when he said that there are different rules for engaging in different types of domains. But we need to reject the criteria that he proposes. And so what we need to do now is look for other criteria. And in particular, we're going to be looking for criteria that can help us engage in moral deliberations about deception and lying in business. So we're now going to talk about the question, what rules should govern deception and lying in business? Now, in order to make any progress whatsoever about this question, we need to first have a good understanding of what lying is and what deception is. If we don't know what we're talking about, how can we possibly talk about whether or not it's permissible to do? So let's start with deception. Now, one thing that goes on when I deceive somebody, so if you accuse me of deceiving you, one thing that you're saying is that I intentionally caused you to form a false belief. So imagine that I write a song. I write a satirical song about Apple. And in this song, I talk about how easy it is to repair MacBook Pros. Now, my song was satire. But if you didn't know it was satire, you might listen to it and then form the false belief that MacBook Pros are easy to repair. I don't think it'd be fair, though, to accuse me of having deceived you, because it was not my intention for you to form a false belief. And so, in order for me to deceive you, it needs to be the case that I intended for you to form a false belief. Now, what else is involved in deception, though? Well, one thing that's involved is that I need to believe that what I'm saying is false. So imagine that I open a geology textbook. I don't know very much about geology. I open this textbook and there's a typo. And because of this typo, I come to erroneously believe that the Earth is 4.7 billion years old. Now, of course, the Earth is not 4.7 billion years old. It's around 4.543 billion years old, but I don't know this, and I read the textbook, there's a typo, and so I come to form this false belief. I then tell you that the Earth is 4.7 billion years old, and then as a result, you come to form this false belief. In this case, I also don't think it's fair to say that I deceived you, and it's not fair to say that I deceived you because I had a good reason to believe my false belief, right? And so we now have a second criterion that's a necessary condition for having deceived somebody. You need to believe that what you're saying is false. Now, Thomas Carson, the famous business ethicist, presents this conception of deception as follows. D1, a person S deceives another person S1 if and only if S intentionally causes S1 to believe X, where X is false and X believes that X is false. Now let's consider a case that doesn't fit D1, but still seems like it might be a case of deception. So imagine you come up to me and you say, Aaron, is the moon more than 4.4 billion years old? Now at the time that I wrote that last sentence in my script, I did not know what the answer to that question was because I could not remember when the lunar formation event took place. I couldn't remember if it was really close to the formation of the Earth or whether it happened, a couple 100 million years later. I just could not remember that. And so imagine that in that epistemic state of not remembering when the lunar formation event happens, I say no. I say no. It's not the case that the moon is more than 4.4 billion years old. And as a result of my saying that, you go on to form the false belief that the moon is not more than 4.4 billion years old. Did I deceive you? Now, in that case, I didn't, believe that what I was saying was false. I didn't have any belief one way or the other. I thought it could be true, it could be false, I'm just not sure. I'm agnostic. It seems to be the case that, I deceived you still. And because of that, there's another definition of deception that we're going to have to use. So this is D2. D2, a person S deceives another person S1 if and only if S intentionally causes S1 to believe X, where X is false and S does not believe that X is true. Now, Carson is ambivalent about which of these conceptions is true, and I am too. So what we can do is we can just say, look, there are more permissive and there are less permissive conceptions of what deception is. And when both conceptions are met, it's absolutely clear that we have a case of deception. And when only D2 is met, it's unclear whether deception has happened. It's a little bit of a gray area. Now let's consider another case that is clearly not a case of deception, but seems kind of deceptive. Imagine that you come into the store, I'm an Apple salesperson, and you say, hey, is the RAM soldered to the motherboard? Now instead of answering the question, I get you into a political argument, or I initiate a conversation about your favorite sports team, or I tell you that, hey, the store is about to close in 5 minutes, and we're not going to open again for another 5 days. I do this so that you won't go and read the fine print and discover the answer to this question. So I'm not deceiving you, right? I'm not causing you to form a false belief. What I'm doing is I'm preventing you from forming a true belief. If I just let you continue on in your inquiry into the fine print of the details about this computer, you'd eventually come to the conclusion that, yes, the RAM is soldered to the motherboard. What I did wasn't deception, because again, I didn't cause you to form a false belief. But what I did was something else. I did something called keeping you in the dark. And that's another thing that we can do. We can keep people in the dark. So finally, let's talk about lying. Now, imagine that you ask me the same question that we just used in the last example. Hey, Aaron, is the RAM soldered to the motherboard? And I have a picture of the internal parts of a MacBook Pro. And in this picture, you can see a motherboard with some removable RAM chips. And you look down and you assume that the answer to your question is no. Now, I put that picture down there knowing that I was going to be deceiving you. But notice that I don't use any words. I just have a picture there, right? So I've deceived you because I caused you to form a false belief, but, I did so without using any words. Some forms of deception count as lying, though. And it's lying when we use our words to cause you to form the false belief. And so what I can do is I can explicitly state, no, the RAM is not soldered to the motherboard. If I tell you that, I've gone beyond mere deception, and I'm doing this sort of deception that counts as a lie. And Carson expresses this conception of lying as follows. L1, to lie is to make a false statement that one does not believe to be true, or alternatively, that one believes to be false, with the intention of causing others to have false beliefs. So let's imagine another scenario that doesn't fit the definition of lying that I just surveyed, but still does kind of seem like a lie. And we're going to consider this scenario to see whether we need a more permissive definition of lying for going forward. Imagine that I've just gotten fired from Apple because I made too many YouTube videos disparaging their overpriced products. Now you come into the new shop where I'm working, which happens to be a Dell shop, and you say, hey, this new laptop, tell me, is the battery fused to the motherboard? Is it soldered on? Now, I think that it is soldered on because I just worked for Apple, and that's how it is on the new MacBook Pros. But it turns out that it isn't soldered on. But I have this false belief, and so what I do is I think, okay, I got to lie to this customer so that I can make the sale. So I lie, and I say, oh, no, it's not soldered on. Now, I have just communicated true information to you because, in fact, it is not soldered on. But I think that I've communicated false information to you. Does that count as a lie? Well, if you think that it does count as a lie, we're going to need a new definition of lying, and that's what L2 is. So L2, to lie is to make a statement that one does not believe to be true, or alternatively, that one believes to be false, with the intention of causing others to have false beliefs. So now we've discussed what it means to keep somebody in the dark, to deceive them, and to lie to them. We're going to go on and talk about rules for whether it's permissible to deceive someone, to keep them in the dark, or to lie to them. All right, so let's now talk about the permissibility of lying, deceiving, keeping people in the dark in business. So imagine that I am a violin bow salesperson, and I talk to a customer and I say, what I have here for sale is a mint condition bow by Francois Xavier Tort. It is in mint condition and you can have it for the low price of $80,000. Now, a genuine Tort violin bow that's in mint condition for 80 grand is a very good deal. But as it happens, I lied to the customer. This bow was actually a German replica from the late 19th century. And it's worth at most, $5,000. So later that night, I'm driving home in my Ferrari, and it stalls. So I take it to the dealer and I say, hey, can you repair this this car for me? A couple hours later, I get a call, and the dealer says, there's a problem with your Ferrari. What it appears is that somebody has taken a Ferrari chassis and attached it expertly, I might add, to an expensive Toyota vehicle. So if I tell you this story and I expect you to sympathize with me, I'm likely to be disappointed. Because you're most likely going to respond by saying, well, isn't that what you did to the customer? Like, isn't that exactly what you did when you were selling that Tort bow, or that German bow, and pretending that it was a genuine Tort bow? The idea behind this response is that I got to be consistent. If I think it's okay to trick my customers into making a sale under false pretenses, then I don't get to complain when somebody else does that to me. And Carson calls this idea the golden rule. Consistency requires that if I think it would be morally permissible for someone to do a certain act to another person, then I must not object to someone doing the same act to me in relevantly similar circumstances. Now, this rule is extremely useful for evaluating the permissibility of lying, deceiving, and keeping people in the dark in a variety of different contexts. So let's start by talking about sales contexts. Carson thinks that if we take the golden rule seriously, we're going to arrive at 4 prima facie duties. And when we say these are prima facie duties, what we mean is that they're duties that you should follow, but there could be cases where they conflict with other duties and maybe they get outweighed. So duty 1, salespeople should provide buyers with safety warnings and precautions about goods and services they sell. Prima facie duty 2, salespeople should refrain from lying and deceiving in their dealings with customers. 3, as much as their knowledge and time constraints permit, salespeople should fully answer customers' questions forthrightly and not evade questions or withhold information that has been asked for. However, they are not obligated to answer questions about competing goods and services or give information about other sellers, for example, the price that something sells for at other stores. Number 4, salespeople should not try to steer customers toward purchases that they have reason to think will cause harm to customers without a compensating benefit, or have reason to believe that customers will come to regret deeply. So for each of these rules, the defense is really simple. Just ask yourself whether you would think it morally permissible for a salesperson to do that to you. And if the answer is no, then you can't consistently think that it's okay for you to do that to somebody else if you are in sales. So let's work through this, sort of going through them in order. Now for number 1, surely you don't think it is permissible for me to sell you a product that can kill your child without warning you of the danger. And you also don't think that it's permissible for me to just outright lie to you or deceive you. You also don't think it's permissible for me to fail to answer your questions about how the products I'm selling you work. But you're not going to demand that I advertise for other companies. So that's number 3. And then finally, you recognize that it's possible for people who know more about a product than you to manipulate you, and you wouldn't consider such manipulations permissible in the cases where the seller knows that the manipulation will result in your buying a product that you will later come to regret buying. Now, for example, in the case of the French violin bow, you're not going to have the ability to evaluate the claims that I'm making unless you're an expert in antique French violin bows. So and you're not going to want me to manipulate you in that way. You're not going to want me to cheat you out of $75,000. So on the same token, you can't consistently think that it's okay for you, if you're in sales, to treat your customers in a similar way by lying to your customers in order to manipulate them into buying things that they will later come to regret. So let's now talk about some real-life cases using these rules. Holland, with gross annual sales of approximately $30 million, was the only home heating equipment manufacturer that sold through its own salesman directly from the factory. A Holland salesman would make his way into a house by claiming himself to be an inspector from the gas company or the city, or claim he was making a survey of furnaces. Once inside, he would use his ostensible authority to dismantle the furnace and then flatly refuse to reassemble it on the grounds that to do so would involve grave dangers of an explosion. If the furnace was that of a Holland competitor, the salesman would inform the homeowner that it had passed its useful life and was not worth the expense involved in repairing it, or that the manufacturer had gone out of business and necessary replacement parts were unattainable. At this moment, though, the solution presented itself miraculously at the door. A Holland furnace man, the inspector's buddy who had been waiting around the corner, rang the bell and made the sale. So in this case, what the salesperson is doing is doing a deception or even a lie. And so clearly it's violating Rule 2, which was salespeople should refrain from lying and deceiving in their dealings with customers. So it violates this rule that we can defend using the golden rule. Now, what if the salesperson says the following? They say, well, our customers that we're doing this to actually have inferior products. So it's justified that we do this kind of paternalistic little deception in order to make their lives better off. Does that justify the deception? And the answer is hell no. Like obviously not. What a silly thing to say. You don't know what your customers' needs are. You don't know whether your customers are saving money so that they can pay for a really difficult medical procedure that's expensive. And by assuming that you know what's best for your customers and that what's best is for them to have, this more expensive product, if they don't really need to do the expense right now, if they're capable of using the old furnace for a little bit, you might be depriving them of a really important medical procedure that they need to have. So no, it is no defense of deception to say that you think that you know what's best for your customer and that you can trick them into spending money that they don't need to spend. So let's talk about another example. Sears once deliberately lied in an advertisement for a new washing machine, and they made two claims that were false. One claim that they made was that you don't need to do a rinse and a scrape of your plates before you put them in the dishwasher. Another claim they made was that the high temperatures of the final rinse would kill dangerous microorganisms on the plates. So this deception harmed customers in an actual way and also in a potential way that may have been realized. We're not sure whether it was. So the way that it definitely harmed customers was that they spent hundreds of dollars more on the dishwasher than they would have spent if these claims hadn't been made. And these claims were both false. Like, you needed to actually scrape and rinse the dishes before you put them in the dishwasher in order to get it to work. And also the final rinse did not sterilize things. It didn't, kill all the microorganisms that were on there. And the way that this was potentially harmful, in addition to the money that the customers lost by buying this product as opposed to cheaper products that they would have bought if the claims had been made, is that people would use these products to clean cans that would then be used for household canning. Or they would use them to clean baby bottles, potentially introducing babies to harmful microorganisms. Right? And so a Sears advertising executive who makes these claims is clearly being inconsistent if they wouldn't want the same things to be done to them. And of course they wouldn't want the same things to be done to them because nobody wants to be deceived in ways that cost them more money than they would spend if they, had known the truth. and in ways that expose themselves and their children to harmful microorganisms, right? And so that particular deception doesn't follow the golden rule. All right, so what if Sears responds by saying, look, I am in a cutthroat business, and if I do not deceive my customers, I'm not going to survive. So I had to do it. So my first response is going to be to laugh at them and say, like, well, how's business doing today? Didn't work out too well for you, did it? But the second thing I'm going to say is, like, what an unintelligent, awful thing to say. Like, if you need to deceive your customers in order to stay in business, then you don't deserve to be in business. The contribution that you're making to society is probably not that important. We might be better off without you, right? So that does not count as a justification for deception. Now, I'm going to close by talking about deception in negotiations. So imagine that I'm going to sell my house, and I would be willing to sell it for anything above $195,000. Now, you want to buy a house, and you're willing to buy it for anything below $215,000. So there's this $20,000 bargaining window between my lower threshold and your upper threshold. So if I tell you what my lower threshold is, I just come right out and say it, you're going to come back and say, oh, my upper threshold is $195,000. And if you tell me what your upper threshold is, I might say, oh, my lower threshold just so happens to be $215,000. So what should we say? You know, given that you and I are both engaged in this game, we're going to be exaggerating our thresholds. You know, is it permissible for me to misstate my bargaining position or for you to misstate your bargaining position? So Carson thinks that the answer is yes. It is okay to misstate your bargaining position. And his defense of this has to do with something called self-defense. And here's how he expresses the self-defense principle. It is permissible to lie or attempt to deceive others about one's negotiating position, provided that 1. One's negotiating partner is doing the same and is likely to harm one thereby. 2. One cannot prevent or substantially mitigate this harm short of lying or attempting to deceive oneself. And 3. The harm one causes the other party does not greatly exceed the harm that one will suffer if one does not lie or attempt to deceive. So the basic idea is this. If someone is trying to lie or deceive me, and the only way I can protect myself from the lie or the deception is to lie or deceive in response, then it's okay for me to do that. It's okay for me to lie or deceive in response, in self-defense, as long as the harm that I cause by the lie or the deception isn't like out of proportion with the harm that they were trying to inflict upon me. So, you know, if all I'm doing is maybe lowering the amount of money you're going to get by $5,000 on a house purchase, that's not that bad. But it's not okay for me to deceive you into like driving your car into a ravine so that you die after forging a fake will that would give all your money to me. That's not okay, because that is grossly out of proportion to the lie that you were trying to do to me, that the harm that your deception would have caused me. So one thing that's important to note is that the principle of self-defense is consistent with the golden rule. I'm not going to object to somebody, deceiving somebody else to prevent themselves from being harmed by a deception, if it's the case that the deception that they tell in self-defense isn't out of proportion with the deception that they're protecting themselves from in terms of the harms that are involved. And if somebody, engages in a little bit of deception with me in a negotiation where I know that I'm playing this game too, I'm not going to, hold that against them. I wouldn't object to them doing that. But I would object to somebody deceiving a customer who has not agreed to play this bluffing game, right? In that case, the deception is not justified in self-defense. And what we'll notice is that it doesn't withstand scrutiny from the perspective of the golden rule, and it also doesn't withstand scrutiny from the perspective of this self-defense principle, because it's not an attempt to protect yourself from somebody else who's trying to deceive you. So at the end of the day, this is the end of the video, we still have basically accommodated the important thing that Carr was saying. We can respect his basic insight that in different domains, we need different rules for engaging in moral deliberations. But we've moved way beyond his vague and way too permissive criteria that he offered for establishing the rules for deception and lying in the business game. We need a lot more than just saying if it's legal and if it seems consistent with conventional morality, then it's okay. And we've done that. We've come up with a golden rule that generates very nuanced principles that protect customers from particular kinds of harms that might happen during business transactions, but while still preserving an ability to defend yourself in negotiations against people who are trying to lie and deceive.